And welcome. It's my job to welcome you to this next session, which I expect will be a very interesting one. So welcome. Just a few comments. We all know that there are so many important, critically important issues to address nowadays that have public and private implications. Clearly, the importance of economic development and innovation, high tech are critical to them all, really across the board. As a law firm, K&L Gates operates out of 44 offices across 5 continents. We cover dozens of practice areas seeking to add value to clients, help them with their challenges, and help them seize their opportunities. While we're global, we have deep, deep roots right here in Pittsburgh. We all know Pittsburgh is special. It's got really a unique combination of industrial and energy heritage and continuing strength, high-tech capability, financial services and healthcare superiority, brilliant academic institutions turning out brilliant graduates every single year. These are strengths on which our region should be proud and on which we can build. All of our clients, and we're fortunate enough to represent them, again, here in Pittsburgh, some with national presence, international presence, or aspirations. They all have different goals. They all have different perspectives. But one thing we hear consistently across the board from clients is we need thoughtful economic development. We need thoughtful cooperation between public and private interests. We need to be very thoughtful about unleashing the power of technology and high tech. It's the only way to compete in today's world successfully. And that's true regardless of your political ideology, your political persuasion, regardless of your industry. So I really look forward to a thoughtful discussion. Very grateful to our local leadership, our congressional leadership, Senator Casey, that chamber, the Pittsburgh Alliance, everyone involved in bringing these discussions together, because they're really, really important to all of us. So with that, let me turn it over to our moderator, Patrice. Over to you. Thank you again on behalf of K&L Gates.
Thank you, James. And good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today to discuss innovation and economic development, the role of federal policy and innovation, and what can Pittsburgh do to continue advancing as a global tech and innovation leader. We hope that you found the conversations on Monday useful and informative. Today we have 2 panels that we hope will be interactive with audience participation. So please, by all means, submit your questions and answers at the bottom of your Zoom window. And on behalf of the Greater Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce and the entire staff of the Allegheny Conference, we thank our sponsors for their generous support. And without them, we could not continue our work. In this panel, sponsored by K&L Gates, we will be joined by United States Senator Robert Casey Jr. and economic development thought leaders to discuss the critical role of federal policy in increasing the velocity by which the Pittsburgh tech and innovation sector is advancing. The foundation has been set in Pittsburgh with world-class research institutions producing top talent and many globally recognized tech firms. But what else is needed, and what policies can further facilitate economic growth? We will also be taking a look at the Brookings Report, the impact of tech innovation across America, and diving into the future of high-tech innovation sectors, and widening the nation's regional divides. I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us today. And let's start with some opening remarks. So to begin, we all know the great work that Senator Casey has done on behalf of the region in issues like waterways investments, and we know firsthand how valuable and important having Senator Casey as a partner with our organization is. So I'm excited to introduce and hear some opening remarks from Senator Robert P. Casey Jr., United States Senate. Thank you for joining us today, Senator Casey.
Well, Patrice, thank you for gathering us together and for your introduction and for the work you're doing today to moderate. I want to thank Dr. Atkinson and Mark Anthony Thomas, as well as James, who started us off from K&L Gates. And also I saw Matt Smith earlier, and I know there's representation from throughout the county and throughout the region. I wanted to start by acknowledging what I think is fairly obvious, that we're not only in the midst of the worst public health crisis in a century, but we're also in the midst of a jobs crisis, an economic collapse that we're still digging out of and will be digging out of for a good while. I was looking at and have become maybe a little too obsessed with the unemployment numbers in our state, but we're at a statewide at an almost 40-year high. It's about 37 years. And in particular communities, it's at least as of July, very, very high, including southwestern Pennsylvania. So unfortunately, I think the challenge will be, even as we get beyond the virus, as we hope to be able to begin to do in 2021, the jobs crisis, the economic challenge will remain with us. So these discussions we're having today will be essential in terms of a full and substantial recovery. We know that this economic challenge will disproportionately impact certain communities. Black and brown communities for sure. They have suffered disproportionately from both the pandemic, the deaths from the pandemic, from the virus, as well as they suffered disproportionately already in terms of the job impact. You all, I think, have heard the Federal Reserve number, the kind of the 40-40 number. Almost 40% of households making less than 40,000, had lost a job in the month of March. Some of that, there's been some recovery there, but still the unemployment rates, the jobless rates are too high. We also know from our history that women and low-wage workers and non-college educated workers and minorities are the hardest hit and will be the least able to recover absent a real strategy to help them. We know that recent high school and college graduates will struggle, as will older workers. So I believe the federal government has to act, has to respond. I think we're making a mistake in the Senate right now in not having a robust relief bill that addresses a range of issues, the list of which, or the itemization of which, I won't go into right now. But in addition to what we would do in the near term on a relief bill, I think there needs to be a whole other strategy in the next several years that's focused on getting the economy out of the ditch and getting it moving. I think the work that the folks on this panel have been thought leaders on will be central to that, especially for communities. And finally, let me say this. I approach any suggestion about what the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County or southwestern Pennsylvania should do. I approach that conversation with humility because it's a region of our state, the region you all live in, that has already invented its own future. When you consider the devastation of the late 70s and early 80s steel crisis, which was about as bad an economic crisis as any region of any part of the country has ever suffered in American history. It was a horrific time for the people of Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, and the Southwest. And you figured out a way to get out of that ditch. I have no doubt you'll figure out a way to continue to innovate and grow and prosper in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Excited to introduce now Dr. Robert D. Atkinson, President of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Good afternoon, Dr. Atkinson.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you and also with Senator Casey. So I just spend a few minutes talking about sort of maybe this broader question of why should we be thinking about innovation in a place like Pittsburgh? I mean, I know you all think we should be thinking about that, but why should the country be thinking about that? The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and the Brookings Institution wrote a major report late last year looking at the really fairly dramatic rise of technology disparity among regions. And for example, we found that 5 places, metros, Boston, San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, and San Diego, so that's really only 4 if you think about San Jose and San Francisco kind of being one big one. they accounted for more than 90% of the nation's innovation sector job growth between 2005 and 2017. And in that, we're not counting just software jobs, we're counting hardware jobs, we're counting a whole machines, a whole biotech, a whole set of advanced industries that are critical to our future. So, one level you can say, well, the US is doing okay, but we're concentrating these jobs in certain places. And what's wrong with that? Isn't that a good thing? And it's a bad thing in our view for two big reasons. One is, if you've ever been to Seattle or San Francisco recently, my son just got a job there, and he was he was astounded that his little, I think, a studio apartment, he pays more in rent than I pay in my mortgage in Bethesda, Maryland. And, so their costs in these places have just gone through the roof. Traffic congestion is terrible. And so what are these companies doing there that are in these places? What these companies are doing is they're saying, yeah, we'll keep our core functions in these places, but we need to keep expanding. And so we need to go to other technology hubs where we can find suppliers and research institutes and companies and workers. Unfortunately, they're going to places like Shanghai. They're going to places like Tel Aviv. They're going to other parts of the world. And it turns out, when you really look at this, Shanghai costs are pretty close to Pittsburgh costs. They're not that far off the mark. It's not as if, these places are dirt cheap anymore. So in our view, what we said is, look, if we could have a federal initiative that would help places that already have some capabilities, and Pittsburgh is clearly in that camp. It's got strong capabilities. It's not, I don't know, it's not, I used to drive up to Finger Lakes every year, and I used to go through a place called Moosic, which I think is near Scranton. No offense to Moosic, but it doesn't have capabilities to be an innovation hub. Pittsburgh clearly does. And so the answer is, well, why should the federal government be playing a role here? And the answer, I think, is pretty clear, is we've had essentially subnational technology-based economic development efforts for 3 or 4 decades. When I wrote my PhD dissertation at UNC Chapel Hill, my dissertation was on that, and I spent a bunch of time in Harrisburg because I was studying the Ben Franklin Partnership and other things that Pennsylvania had really been the leader on it and remains the leader. But our point is, everybody's doing these things now, and they're just not enough. They're not enough to sort of get a few places over the hump to really become self-sustaining places. And if you think about the Amazon desire to get a second headquarters, everybody was, jumping over themselves to get that. But why did they pick New York and Washington? And New York thing maybe didn't work out. They picked it because it was a safe bet. Sure, it cost them a little bit more money, but they knew they were going to get pretty good, reasonable, universities. They were going to get a lot of skilled workers. And so they were like, all right, we'll pay for that. So our view is, if we can help a few places like a Pittsburgh of the world, or an Indianapolis of the world, or whatever that might be, who already have important strengths. Your universities are incredibly strong. You've got a lot of technology companies, software, hardware, biotech. Help them get over the hump. Then we think that in 10 years, we could have another 5, 8, maybe 10, really world-leading technology hubs. And so that's what we were pushing for. We've had some good success. Senator Schumer had a bill, the Endless Frontier Act, with Senator Todd Young, a Republican from Indiana. I'm sorry, I don't know who else was on the bill, but a number of people on the bill. And a component of that bill was to provide a significant amount of funding for regions like Pittsburgh, so a national competition. A lot of the money would go to R&D, but not just that. Incentives for companies to invest, workforce development, a whole set of things for about a 10-year period to really help a region get up to that next level, get over the hump. So I'm really optimistic. I think Congress, both the House and the Senate, are thinking about this kind of challenge now, and why we really need to resolve it. I just say one last thing, and then I'll close. Is our politics are perhaps more divisive than they've been, I don't know, since the Civil War, and really hard. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's a lot of people in a lot of places that feel like they've been left behind, and their regions have been left behind. And I think if we don't address that, it's just going to be harder to get back to normal civil discourse that has made America the great country that it's been. So I'll stop there and I'll look forward to any comments or questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Atkinson. And excited to introduce now President of the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, Mark Anthony Thomas. Thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon. So first, thank you for having me. I will say when we saw the article and the report that really mapped out that Pittsburgh should be among the places that the federal government helps catalyze, that was definitely welcome news. For all of the history that we've had, especially for the last 2 decades, we've seen studies that really map out a future for Pittsburgh and the innovation economy. But there was something about the Brookings report that I think created an urgency for us to really make a lot of immediate actions. And so, and being fairly new to Pittsburgh, I moved here last year to lead the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, but I worked in New York City and Los Angeles leading a lot of their economic development efforts there. The one thing you find in those smaller markets is we don't have the resources that you have in some of the more wealthier places. And so there's no coincidence that the cities and the regions across the globe that have really catalyzed a lot of innovation using public and tax dollars to really make it happen, that has happened in the places that are somewhat the winner-take-all markets. And so I think with the federal government really playing a partnership role, it can allow for the Pittsburghs of our country to really make the investments we need to make to really pull us to the next level. What I think is special and a great case study across the globe for what we have as a region is we have the assets that every place would love to have. And you can't really replicate that easy. It takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort to really build the types of academic research and skill-based economy that we have. The piece that we're missing that PRA is working closely with our partners on is how do we then transform that into an economy for the future and create a mecca for entrepreneurs and talent across the world to want to be in Pittsburgh, build great businesses in Pittsburgh, and then help us transform our economy. And so the more help we can get, the more work we can do. Without support, we still have an ambitious plan that we think will still advance our agenda. But it's always great when you have state, counties, and the federal government really pushing us to that next level. I think it's important as we really map out a plan to build an inclusive economy that people understand that diversity wants to be part of that future economy. And so the entire movement you see around inclusive tech and now the tech companies really investing in pipelines to bring in more Black and brown talent is driven by the grassroots movements that happen in a lot of the innovation hubs for people to be part of the future and be part of that creative energy that's transforming everything from our smartphone devices to artificial intelligence. And so it's a great opportunity to really hit a number of policy objectives by really building up the innovation economy. I look forward to continuing the conversation, and I'll turn it back over to Patrice.
Thank you. All right, so I think we'll get started with some questions and answers here. And I'd like to start first with Senator Casey. So the first question to start would be, legislation has been proposed in the U.S. Senate that would create innovation centers across the country backed up by significant federal investment. What's your take on this legislation, Senator Casey?
Well, I think there are two that I'm aware of that are relevant here. One is the one that Dr. Atkinson just referred to. It's the Senator Schumer, Senator Young, the Endless Frontiers Act. That would provide, this one provides $10 billion for the establishment of regional technology hubs across the country to launch new companies or revive American manufacturing, create new jobs to jumpstart local economies. It would also expand the National Science Foundation and grant, and this is even more significant, grant $100 billion for strategically advancing science and tech R&D. So that's certainly one that I'm supportive of, as well as the Innovation Centers Acceleration Act. That's by Senators Coons and Durbin. And that's an $80 billion investment by way of the National Science Foundation, 80 billion over 9 years. So those kinds of efforts, I think, are going to be crucial, and it has to be the federal government. We know that, as the Post-Gazette reported not long ago, that federal research and development dollars hit a 65-year low, and we've been going in the wrong direction for far too long. We can't compete with China with R&D numbers like that, where the number is going down instead of maintaining the investment, or we can't even compete with Europe. I think Pittsburgh in the region, I should say, is the kind of region that can not only benefit from more R&D investment by the federal government, but is well positioned to not just benefit from it, but to make good use of it. R&D in Pittsburgh and the universities has been one of the hallmarks of success. So that's point number one. Make two more points and then I'll stop. Often we hear that the federal government should be picking winners and losers. Well, if you look at a lot of the regions around the country that have become technology hubs or something close to that, whether it's the Bay Area, as the doctor mentioned earlier, or Boston, or the Research Triangle in North Carolina, the investments from the federal government often played a significant role in that success. So we have to make sure that federal investment in R&D is there for communities that warrant that kind of investment. We also have to continue to diversify, and again, I say it with humility because you all have done it in one way or another, or those who were walking in your shoes just about 2-3 decades ago, because if Pittsburgh didn't innovate, it would have died. If it didn't diversify long ago, it would have died. It had to, from a steel economy to a much more broad-based technology economy, a healthcare economy, and really in a much more innovation economy. So I think the alignment between a series of new federal initiatives and investments with what Pittsburgh and Allegheny County in southwestern Pennsylvania can offer and can take advantage of is really exciting.
And Mark and Dr. Atkinson, any questions that I'm asking? If there's any comments that you want to chime in on, please, by all means, for organic conversation. Next question, I'll go to Mark. How are you building Pittsburgh's tech and innovation ecosystems?
Mainly in partnership, right? And it's a part of the role that the conference of the PRA plays is we have convening power. And so first, it's really, over the last year, we spent a lot of time trying to understand where is growth projected, what industries, what subsectors, whether cybersecurity or robotics or the creative economy, do we anticipate growth? What are some of the research-driven innovations that are expected? And so being able to work closely with our partners to kind of map that out allowed us to really understand what the economy as a whole will look like over the next decade, and then how do we then position Pittsburgh to get a fair share of that. And so in December of last year, we published our Next is Now report that really mapped out all of the proactive efforts that we would implement to really go after those subsectors and those industries so that we can really create a more robust innovation economy. And if anything, it's really project by project. It's like a building block effort where over time, people will really see and feel like we're in a place where the momentum is even further than it was over the last few years. And I think just looking at the announcements that we've had this year and the announcements that we anticipate over the next 16 months or so, even with COVID, will really show progress that we're building an inclusive, innovative tech hub that rivals the greatest in the world.
Thank you. Dr. Atkinson, if you could answer, what are the top 2 to 3 biggest needle movers when it comes to federal or even state policy in tech and innovation economic development?
Sure. So having led state governors' economic development efforts or innovation and tech policy efforts for a long time, and being on the board of the State Science and Technology Institute, I'm pretty familiar with what states are doing and what regions are doing. And I don't know, I hate to sound sort of cynical, but everybody's doing, everybody kind of knows what the playbook is now. When you were really the pioneers back in the 80s, and you were writing the playbook in Pennsylvania. And now kind of everybody knows that, okay, you've got to really do things around university industry partnerships. You've got to help spur commercialization out of universities. You've got to really get a great STEM system. You make sure your tax system is good and infrastructure, all that. So I guess I'd really focus more on what the federal government can do. So, for example, if you look at what, I think one of the biggest drivers there is, frankly, as Senator Casey alluded to, is really federal R&D. The federal government now spends less on R&D as a share of our economy than we did before Sputnik. Shocking number when you think about it, but we still spend money, and a lot of it goes to regions. But if you think about it, Research Triangle Park, they got 2.7 billion a year. Boston's 2.9, San Francisco 3.3, and Pittsburgh 1.3. Now, to be clear, that 1.3 is pretty good. A lot of regions don't get hardly anything who are your size, so I'm not knocking that. But imagine where you would be if you were at 2.3 every year. Now we're talking about a systemic game changer, particularly if you can have that money focused on an alignment between the industries that you think are for the future for Pittsburgh, and then the university capabilities to help support that, whether it's new startups or working with existing companies, or frankly, cranking out a great university STEM workforce that is going to be attractive for companies from all around the world. So that I think is really number one. If we could, it was interesting when the National Science Foundation bill was passed, and I think it was 1951. There was a big debate in the U.S. And on one side of the debate was Vannevar Bush from MIT, who said we should ignore regional issues, ignore that, just spend the money where the best people are. And then there was another, a member of Congress, Harley Kilgore, I believe from West Virginia, who said, no, wait a minute, I get all that, but we should also think a little bit about this other question of making sure that places get it, because it's political economy. And if you think about why the money has gone down so much, there are a lot of members from states or districts who don't have a stake in this. Their regions don't get all that much, and so they don't worry about it. They don't fight about it. It's one thing for Boston Chamber to come in, or thankfully you guys coming in, but we don't have enough real support. So that's why I think having more R&D focused on heartland places that with real potential like Pittsburgh is so important. And then the second thing I think is making sure that the region's institutions themselves are innovative. Everybody talks about innovation, but innovation is not just about a widget. It's about doing things in a new way, doing things in a different way. And there's just, lots and lots of opportunities to do that. I mean, I look at some places around the country that have embraced project-based learning for STEM. Now, again, I'm sorry, I don't know what Pittsburgh has done. Maybe you're already doing that, but that's just an example. And making sure that that kind of project-based learning is in, all neighborhoods, all communities, all socioeconomic groups. That's to me, a really cool thing, but it's a lot of high schools, middle schools, they sort of, you just sit down at a desk and you do your thing and then you go to the next class. So that's innovation. That's doing something in a new way. And so I think, to me, that's one of the most important things regions can do is, we've been doing something for 20 years. Should we do it in a new way? And that would help us become more attractive to companies that are innovative companies in and of themselves.
Thank you. My next question, I think everyone can kind of just jump in. So by all means, it's expected that innovation and 5G technology will go hand in hand. How can communities like Pittsburgh embrace 5G, and what regulatory policies need to be enacted to ensure that PA doesn't fall behind in the race for 5G?
Well, unless the senator wants to jump in, I could go first. So ITIF, my colleague Doug Brake, has written extensively on that question. Feel free to take a look at it. number one, the U.S. is going to do fine in 5G. We're ahead of Europe. Our FCC has done a good job of opening up spectrum for 5G, although we need more what's called mid-band spectrum, and that's going to happen. So, and we've got very good companies, wireless companies, who are committed to deploying 5G radio networks, particularly, frankly, in an urban or a metropolitan region like Pittsburgh. Now, maybe some of the rural areas in the state are going to be later on in that process, but the metro areas, I think we're quite on track to be a strong 5G player globally. I think one of the biggest things that regions can do is really take away and limit some of the barriers to deployment. For example, in the old wireless world, you would put up a big tower, you'd see them as you go around, the 4G LTE towers. There's one big giant radio up there, if you will. 5G is very different. You have these little small things that are like, people say they're the size of pizza boxes, and you need hundreds, thousands of them. And some communities are actually requiring a separate permit for each one and a big fee for each one. And I can pretty much guarantee you that communities that do that will be slower in the queue. They'll be at the back of the queue for companies who have limited capital. They're going to deploy their 5G in places where it's just easy to get it out there. And I'm not talking about, no regulation, or I'm not talking about that at all. I'm just talking about can regions and cities really make it easy for carriers to put these networks out there. I think that's probably the most important thing that a region could do. And the other thing would be really build on this notion of digital inclusion. We have a podcast now that we launched a few months ago called Innovation Files, and the one coming up soon is a guy in a guy in Detroit who leads the mayor's digital inclusion efforts. And again, I don't know what Pittsburgh is doing. All I can say is I'm really impressed with what Detroit is doing in this space. It's really phenomenal. They brought all the players together, the universities, the telco carriers, the cable carriers. They're working on making sure people have devices, on training. And I think that's an important thing if you want to move forward in 5G, because if you have a community where lots of people understand 5G and want to use it and are able to use it, that's going to make it easier. So I'll stop there.
Great, and I'll add, and the doctor touched on this, that to some extent the ease of business and the ease of partnerships to innovate is important as regions compete on who's kind of the regions of the future. Also outside the United States, I'll kind of add to what was cited earlier. Other countries have been studying the American playbook. And so they've somewhat nationalized innovation and are investing in their own hubs. You see that in Canada, you say that across the entire European Union, and all over Asia. They've hired Americans to come work there to really build the type of expertise that we've perfected here so they can compete with us in the future. And so those two things create an urgency for us to really be good and be good partners and be active in driving all of these things at a much more rapid pace.
Would Patrice just add to that, very helpful and instructive to listen to both Mark and Dr. Atkinson, especially on some of the challenges that 5G will present from a regulatory standpoint. What we cannot do and what we have to learn from is the terribly unfortunate experience with high-speed internet broadband in our state and a lot of states. What we thought was a rural Pennsylvania small town problem, which it still is, and it's still a national disgrace, but also became a whole other problem in this COVID era, or this period of time since March, where even in cities that had a lot of connectivity, you had a lot of children in their home trying to learn, and for a variety of reasons they couldn't learn because they didn't have the kind of connection or broadband that would allow them to do their homework. And that's when it becomes that fundamental. It's everyone knows the adverse consequences to a business, especially a small business, that doesn't have high-speed internet. But when you take it back even further to a child in grade school or high school, the consequences, or I should say that the accumulated consequences of that over time are almost incalculable. So we've got to make sure, first of all, we still have a ton of work to do to deploy broadband in a state like ours. We're way behind, and a lot of other states are way behind. We're not the only one. But we have to make sure we don't make similar mistakes. I know the analogy isn't perfectly aligned, but we can't make these same mistakes when it comes to 5G. But the regulatory hurdles that's instructive for someone like me to hear.
I have another question here. So Senator Casey, a question was asked, I hear repeatedly from members of our chamber that they have job openings, but not enough viable candidates. Some of those employers rely on the H-2B program to fill roles. Senator Casey, can you update us on where we stand with the program? Also, other visas and programs that are used to be more readily available to attract talent to positions that there is not enough skilled talent to fill domestically. The innovation and technology community could really use these argumenting resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure I can give you a snapshot today, but we can certainly provide that. But there's no question that in a region like southwestern Pennsylvania, and maybe especially in the city of Pittsburgh itself, that we have to make sure there's a ready supply of the kind of high-skilled workers that you're going to need, and that's why the program is essential for this administration and for Congress to make sure that we can move people through that, make sure that they can have access to that kind of talent. And unfortunately, the larger debate about often a debate that doesn't shine much light, it's mostly cloaked in darkness, is the larger immigration debate, which is often a very negative, a very incendiary debate, and any related issue becomes subsumed under that, or becomes greatly damaged by that larger debate. We have to be mindful of the fact that the United States didn't grow in spite of immigration; it grew with immigration, and with the kind of talent that we still get from all over the world. And we have to take advantage of that. Unfortunately, there's people in Washington that are, for years now, especially the last couple of years, have been undermining that kind of approach, that kind of openness, generally on immigration, but specifically when it comes to the kind of talent that employers are going to need in the city of Pittsburgh and the region. So I would hope those on the call would make that clear to folks in Washington, some of whom may listen to what I'm saying and some of whom may not, but they'll listen to you.
Thank you. Mark, so how does Pittsburgh compare to other mid-sized cities and regions in the area on innovation? We have robust universities, tech startups, but where do you see voids? What can we build on?
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier, the institutional assets that we have outrank anything that you're going to find in most mid-sized cities. At least for the level of what they're able to produce and the level of research that they're able to conduct. The piece that we're really missing is that commercialization piece. And I didn't know this until I moved here, but we don't have as much of a culture yet around startups and just kind of that ecosystem of just people flocking from anywhere. It's kind of when you get on a bus and just say, I want to build a business in a new place. And so that is part of the culture that I think we need to build out. And that's something we're working closely with our partners on. If we solve for that, we never want to be a region where we're super overcrowded and it creates other challenges that make us regret kind of being too much of an attractive place. And so I do think we have to have smart growth policies and a strategy. But the pieces I think that we can build out will make us a better place, a better region, and make the entrepreneurs and the tech ecosystem more attractive without it creating kind of the negative aspects.
Thanks, Mark. Dr. Atkinson, so your report calls for a competitive process where potential growth centers across the U.S. would receive substantial funding, substantial financial funding and regulatory support to become new and self-sustaining for innovation centers. And the Senate's legislation mirrors a similar model. Can you give us a global perspective on what this type of opportunity would mean for the nation's innovation-based competitiveness?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, I think the big central question, there are two central questions. One is why, why do anything at all, which I think I've already addressed. The second is why do 10? Why not do 40? And the answer is really because in our view, what companies are looking for is they're looking for critical mass. If you're a tech company and you want to go to a place, you want to know, first of all, that if you lose your job, which is very often in tech, it's companies are going out of business all the time or whatever, you might not, and you've got a spouse, you don't want to have to move to a new place. You want to know that there's enough jobs, particularly in your field, in a particular place. And so that's why I think having real tech depth in a place matters. And sort of trying to do this at 40 or 50 places, you're just not going to get there. The second thing I said before is to get critical mass. I look at Pittsburgh, and I don't mean to be, you're close. I think you're close, but you're not quite there yet, and you're close. And so to me, a federal investment that, again, where it would be, open, fair competition, where some place like NIST or National Institute of Standards would have a fair panel, and part of the being able to win would be, how much skin in the game are you guys putting in? Do you have business and community leaders that are committed to this, or is it sort of bifurcated? Are you willing to put your own resources into helping out? And places that I think, and do you have a vision and you have resources? I think if you think about that, if we could do that, I'm really confident that a place like Pittsburgh could go up to that next level. It's almost like you don't go like this. You go up kind of like this, and then up and up. It's kind of stepwise. So I think there's a chance that we could do that. And I think also, one last thing I'll say, I've talked to a number of technology companies, big US technology companies, about this idea, and they're all, to a person, very enthused about it. Partly for political reasons, it's better politically for them to be in more states. They would have more Senate supporters, or House supporters. But even more to that, they see it as a core part of their business. That if they can tap into a bigger workforce, they don't want to have to rely on people moving to Silicon Valley. Not everybody wants to do that. So I think that there's, if we could do that, it would be really good for places like Pittsburgh, but also really good for the economy as a whole, the country as a whole.
Can you speak to the advances in growing and attracting diverse and particularly Black tech and innovation contributors? I believe our region's greatness is fundamentally dependent upon true commitment to diverse companies. Question that just came in.
Great, and I'm happy to respond to that. Like, when you actually look at the vibrant ecosystems that people really study and want to replicate, it is that diversity that's driving it. And so you really can't win unless you're open to women entrepreneurs, people of color entrepreneurs, and foreign talent. Like, that is the formula. And so the more conducive we become, which is why I use the term Mecca, to being a place that talent really finds a space here, the more vibrant we'll become as a place. When you actually look at a lot of the entrepreneurship that's happened in the US, the piece that people really don't think a lot about is that international talent and that diverse talent is really what's driven a lot of that success. And so it is not something that you do in addition to, it is crucial to the strategy.
Patrice, I would just add to that, to what Mark said, is I have no doubt that Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania can benefit tremendously from that kind of a focus on diversity and minority-owned business investment. And as I said earlier, or made reference to earlier, the impact of the virus and the economic calamity that's flowed in its wake has particularly adversely impacted minority-owned businesses, many of whom, frankly, still have not benefited to the extent they should have with the Paycheck Protection Program. That's a whole other problem. But over time, the investment there is not only the right thing to do in terms of equity and fairness and opportunity, and that includes the federal government and federal government contracts, which is can be a door opener for a small business. But it's also, I think, a necessity for any region. Just imagine, we can't even imagine what the Atlanta metro region would be like if they hadn't diversified in so many different ways years ago. Pittsburgh has benefited tremendously from the diversity, depending on what era you're talking about, whether the diversity that came from European immigrants and then others who came after them. And now the opportunity is particularly significant, as it has been for a number of years now in the city, because of the great educational institutions you have, the great technology centers you have. That combination can be very powerful. But this is one of those, the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do.
Thank you. So Senator Casey, has the pandemic changed your mindset in terms of any federal investment that we must, re-examine, increase, or decrease?
Well, I would say this. I think that in the aftermath of this pandemic, and even as we're trying to climb, as I said, climb out of that ditch, I think at the federal level, in addition to initiatives like the ones we talked about today on investment in research and development and a focus on innovation, I think legislatively, at least, we're going to have to be thinking as if we're in the New Deal again or something comparable to that. I'm going to be proposing a WPA style program. We got to put a lot of people back to work real fast, because we're getting to the point now, as people are getting back to work and the unemployment rate inches down, where it'll start to level off, and you will have millions of people who, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be the most difficult to place, the most difficult to provide a transition for, or a floor, and that will impact all of us in one way or another. So we're going to have to be thinking about this not the way we were in the midst of and the aftermath of the last recession with the Recovery Act. That was important for its time. Frankly, it was a little too scaled down. We're going to have to be thinking much bigger than that, because there's no way that we're going to have some people back to work and back on track without a brand new initiative or a series of initiatives. So we're going to have to think big, and scale down or scaled back thinking, I think, will only leave a lot of people in the ditch for a lot longer.
Thank you. Dr. Atkinson, you have a different lens into Pittsburgh than those who live here. How is our region perceived by national leaders in this space? What are our weaknesses, and where can we improve?
Sure. So I just would, by the way, I can't help but second everything that Senator Casey just said. I think the COVID crisis is very different than what happened before, because it is fundamentally a restructuring shock. There are going to be sectors of our economy that just won't go back to normal for a long time. One study showed that, or suggested, it's 10 years before airline traffic gets back to normal. You can imagine hotels. Anyway, I think, just to that point, figuring out a way to help people make transitions to the things that will grow, partly through making it easier for people to get the kind of retraining they need now. I just see that as critical, because the economy's not going to come back exactly the way it was. I think it's going to be very different. One way is just, look at all of us. We're all now comfortable using this newfangled device called Zoom, and a lot of workers are going to be working from home, not permanently, not all the time, but you'll see very different patterns. Sorry to get off on that. The Pittsburgh, I frankly don't think anybody thinks about Pittsburgh, unless maybe they're 80 years old, as a steel hub. I mean, I think you've overcome that. I think how most people who are, thoughtful, think about these things at all, think about Pittsburgh as, here's a place that went through a painful restructuring, was able to restructure around kind of meds and eds to some extent. There's also a view. Pittsburgh's really good at robotics, although a company that will go unnamed took a lot of your robotics engineers. And which is, by the way, a real issue, because I think, why, and I'm not blaming the company, I'd do it if I were them. Why did that happen? It's partly because we've underfunded our universities, and we need to pay some of this top talent universities more. So I think that's kind of the view, but I don't think, when you hear a narrative of who are the tech hubs in the US, Pittsburgh generally isn't in that conversation. It's New York, it's Boston, it's Austin, it's RTP, it's San Diego, it's Silicon Valley, Seattle, maybe Salt Lake City sometimes. So, it's kind of like the NBA, it's like there's a top tier of teams, then there's a second tier, then you're definitely in the top of the second tier in my view, but I think you're not quite in the sort of national perception, which, is just my view. That's how I would think people look at Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, breaking into that top tier, to me, is what our focus should be. And the reason we're not in that top tier is not based on the natural assets that we have. And I think that is what Brookings and others have really emphasized, that we're designed to be a great innovation hub that really punches at a global scale on behalf of the United States. And so how do we then move into our rightful place and elevate our communities along the way? And so really that should be all of us locking arms to really make that happen.
Thank you, Mark. As we get down to time, just some closing comments. I'd like to start with Senator Casey.
Well, Patrice, thanks so much. And I can't thank you and all those who made this possible, and am honored and humbled to be on a panel with Dr. Atkinson and Mark Thomas on this, or as part of this discussion. You've given me a lot to not just to think about with regard to the role that the federal government plays and the role the United States Senate has to play in this recovery, as well as this commitment to innovation. But you've also given me some ideas about what we can do here just in our own office to continue to focus on this. So that's very much beneficial to me and to our team, and I'm sure to others in the Senate. And I just hope that Brookings will continue to produce reports like it did, and I know it will, that gives us a roadmap and in that case, about a 5-part solution, itemized solutions to focus on these issues. There's no region of the country, I think, that is better positioned in terms of the assets, the intellectual assets, the workforce, and the dynamism that the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County and the region has right now. So it's really just up to us to be part of that strategy to move the city and the region in the right direction. And I think when that happens on a regular basis, the entire Commonwealth, of course, benefits tremendously from that dynamism that comes from great innovation. So thanks for giving me the chance to participate, and I sure learned a lot listening to these guys.
Thank you. Mark, Dr. Atkinson, any final comments before we close out on today's panel?
Yeah, I mean, I just say quickly, I think I want to second what Senator Casey alluded to. He talked a little bit about we need a new deal or new deal. And, you know, to me, I've been in Washington since really the late 80s. My first job was at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I worked in Congress at the Office of Technology Assessment. And to me, this is the most optimistic time in my career for the things I care about. And it's because I think there's been a real shift on both sides of the aisle. For the Republicans, the shift has been, well, we always believed sort of free market, small government was the way to go. And now looking at China, there's a real recognition among many Republicans now that, wait a minute, yeah, sure, business has to lead. Markets are very important. We don't want an overbearing government. But government needs to be more of a partner than they were before. And to me, that's a big change. And on the Democratic side, you see the work of Senator Casey and Schumer and others who thinking really big now. And so I think for you all in the region, there's some real, real opportunities that could come out in the next Congress that that would really be beneficial to you as a region. And I would thank you for trying to push for that. I think the odds of those things happening are a lot higher if people at the regional level talk to their members of Congress and explain just how important this is. Think tanks in Washington like ITIF and Brookings, we can play a role, but we don't, I vote in Maryland, I don't vote in Pennsylvania. And so I think really having your voice in the supporting these kinds of things is just central. So thank you for everything you all are doing. And Mark, you too, thank you.
Thank you. And I'd quickly add, Patrice, that, I think we view our role in working closely with Matt Smith at the Chamber and the broader conference to really help our elected officials in a bipartisan way really understand what Pittsburgh needs to really thrive and to be what people really want it to become so that we can collectively build a great future for the region.
Thank you everyone for taking the time out to speak on today's panel. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody at our criminal justice reform panel in about a half an hour. Senator Casey, thank you. Dr. Robert Atkinson, thank you. And thank you, Mark. Everyone have a great day. I hope that you learned something.
Thanks. Thank you.